The stagflation of the 1970s was a period in which a multitude of countries experienced high inflation as well as high unemployment. To fully understand what stagflation was, we first need to understand the definition. The word roots from stagnant and inflation, as stagflation refers to a period where an economy experiences high inflation alongside stagnant economic growth. The stagflation of the 1970s was caused by a multitude of circumstances. However, poor monetary policies and the rapid increase of oil prices were the main contributing factors. Most current economists identify the oil shock of 1973 as the starting point of stagflation in the 1970s. At the time, most of the world's oil came from a very few select nations, primarily in the Middle East, who worked under the organization named OPEC. However, once Western countries made them unhappy, they used their influence on the world's oil supply to their advantage. OPEC decided to limit the supply of oil to the world by the means of oil embargoes, which are basically OPEC countries purposely limiting the supply of oil to have political influence. When the 1973 oil crisis occurred, OPEC had quadrupled the price of oil from $2.90 to $11.65 a barrel. Gasoline is considered to be inelastic, therefore the large increase in price had a minuscule impact on the demand, which created an overall shortage of fuel. With the price of petroleum increasing, the price of petroleum-based products, such as fuel, also increased and led to greater transportation costs. This increase resulted in all other goods experiencing a spike in cost, which makes this a leading factor of rapid inflation during the 1970s. Keynesian theory is the exploration of the thoughts and discoveries of John Maynard Keynes. Keynesian theory was the main focus of economic theory and policy after World War II and continued to be the most widely accepted theory until the 1970s when stagflation arrived. The issue with Keynesian theory was that Keynes did not think of an appropriate response to stagflation. Another Keynesian thinker, A.W. Phillips, had proposed a model that showed a correlation between unemployment and inflation. The conventional form of thinking regarding unemployment and inflation followed a model called the Phillips curve. This model essentially showed an inverse correlation between unemployment and inflation, meaning that as unemployment went up, inflation went down, and vice versa. However, once stagflation came into play, this model was quickly discredited. As shown in this graph, the stagflation of the 1970s had periods with both high unemployment as well as high rates of inflation. The Phillips curve was immediately thought to give an easy choice for policymakers, as they could either choose between higher unemployment with lower inflation or lower unemployment with higher inflation. This made the Phillips curve one of the main reasons why Keynesian theory became so popular with governments. It seemingly gave them an easy choice to fix all their problems. However, as mentioned earlier, the stagflation completely discredited the Phillips curve. Luckily, there was another economic thinker named Milton Friedman, who in 1968 predicted that both inflation and unemployment would rise together in the following years. Friedman believed that the Phillips curve was only useful in the short term. Friedman stated that when real values would be adjusted, unemployment would return to its previous level and leave behind growing inflation with stagnant unemployment. Friedman's theories also included an easy way to stop inflation by simply reducing total government spending. In any inflation problem, stagflation included, Friedman believed that monetary policy alone can curb inflation. This is to say that instead of blaming outside factors, such as the oil price shock in the 1970s, all inflation-related problems can be solved by regulating government spending and their management of funds. Milton Friedman's perspective on stagflation not only shows how it can occur, but also helps identify holes in Keynesian theory. The stagflation of the 1970s made it so that countries really had to focus on ways to ensure their economy remained sustainable and that it was still growing. The United States president at the time, Richard Nixon, had attempted to reduce the country's dependence on oil. However, this proved ineffective due to the demand of oil significantly outweighing other energy alternatives at the time. Likewise, the Liberal Party of Canada, who was elected into power throughout the 1970s, was burdened with the task of combating stagflation as well. Alberta had to shift its exports from the United States to other provinces within Canada, to their dismay. European nations tried to limit energy consumption as much as they could, with the UK halting TV broadcasting at 10:30 p.m., as well as implementing something called a 3-day week, where commercial energy consumption was limited by the government on certain days of the week. The fundamental problem of economics, scarcity, is also something that is highly apparent in this economic crisis of stagflation. This is evident as the main issues regarding stagflation come from the scarcity of oil, employment, and energy in general. Firms that had the greatest impacts on the 1970 stagflation were the oil firms within the countries in the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. These firms are essentially what caused these harsh economic conditions, as their decisions had global impacts. One of the main reasons these oil companies were able to have such an impact is the oligopolistic market structure of the petroleum industry. This allowed petroleum producing firms to have great influence on price. An oligopoly is when there are a few large companies in an industry, which allows them to control supply very well, essentially controlling price. This rise in the price of oil also affected related industries such as the automotive industry, as vehicles were highly dependent on petroleum-based products at the time. Although allowing supply and demand to control price is a characteristic of a free market/mixed market economy, the economic system that the firms existed in at the time had little influence on the stagflation. As mentioned earlier, the stagflation crisis in the 1970s revolved around two major stakeholders, OPEC and the federal governments. The embargoes placed by OPEC nearly quadrupled the price of oil. This was done intentionally in response to the West siding with Israel against Arab countries in the Yom Kippur War, as well as President Nixon devaluing the American dollar by removing it from the gold standard, which was the currency of choice for OPEC trade agreements, therefore causing them to lose a lot of revenue. The oil embargo was a huge economic trade-off, as although the oil crisis temporarily showed the strength of the Middle East, the region was soon met with political turmoil as a result of their actions. However, these Arab nations were not the only ones to have to make tough economic decisions. Federal governments around the world were tasked with reversing the effects of stagflation and strengthening their nations. The governments were the ones tasked with solving the economic crisis of stagflation in the 1970s. The rising inflation and low economic growth had required government intervention, as they were the only players large enough to actually make a difference and reverse the effects of stagflation. Different countries had different ways of approaching the problem. For example, Canada had implemented rebates, wage rollbacks, and price increases. The United States introduced price and wage controls along with contractionary monetary policies, and the United Kingdom carried out contractionary monetary policies through immense spending cuts as well. Although the United States was able to end the first stagflation crisis, poor policies and careless decision-making meant that the country would go on to face similar crises on a smaller scale multiple times. This economic imbalance generally caused an increase in welfare spending due to the high unemployment rates of the time period. Macroeconomics can be used to better understand stagflation in the 1970s. The growth of GDP is a very useful macroeconomic model to use as it helps show strength of an economy. In the 1970s, the growth of GDP per capita for the United States was significantly lower than that of previous and following decades, showing that the economy at the time was negatively affected by all the events occurring. Unemployment is another useful model, as the employment levels of the 1970s show a lack of growth in the economy. The unemployment rate went from being just over full employment in the 1960s to falling 3 percentage points below just 5 years later. Aggregate supply curves are another useful model to analyze stagflation. By looking at aggregate supply in the 1970s, the effect of cost-push inflation can be clearly identified as one of the driving forces behind stagflation.
Cost-push inflation was a result of massive shortages in the supply of oil, which forced companies to raise their prices in order to overcome their decrease in production. This is illustrated by an increase in price level and a reduction in productivity. Understanding the government policies of the time can also help with understanding why stagflation became such a crisis in the 70s. In terms of fiscal policy, the government implemented tax cuts to fight the economic slowdown and reduced government spending to reduce inflation rates. However, this only worked as a temporary solution and was not very effective in the long run. Monetary policy was also used to try and stop stagflation, but it was ineffective as stagflation only came to an end after inflation rates reached record highs. Many experts believe that if more aggressive action had been taken in monetary policy, stagflation could have ended much sooner.
Stagflation was also the root of growth of income inequality in the 1970s. Prior to the stagflation, income steadily rose at an equal rate for the poor and the rich. Afterwards, however, middle and lower class individuals had experienced an evident decrease in income growth, whilst the wealthy continued to enjoy strong progress. Although the economic climate in the 1970s was defined by stagflation, the story has a happy ending. The long boom followed in the 1980s, and the expansionary period helped to re-strengthen the economy.